One of the biggest mistakes that a podcaster can make is asking the wrong people for feedback on their show. Because when you ask friends or family or coworkers or colleagues or even your most loyal fans for feedback, guess what? Someone who knows you and likes you and trusts you already is always going to tell you what they think you want to hear. Even if you say, please be honest with me, they're still going to tell you what they think you want to hear. And those answers might feel really good in the moment, but guess what? It's not actually going to show you why new listeners aren't hitting play on your podcast. And that is why in this episode, I invited Nachlis, the VP at Coleman Insights, to help you uncover what's really going on in your audience behavior so that you can craft content that your ideal listeners cannot ignore. Now, Coleman Insights is the research powerhouse behind some of today's most listened to shows and brands. And he's going to break down how you can find out what your listeners really want to hear on your show so that you can earn new listener attention and keep those new listeners coming back. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Jay, welcome to the show. I'm so excited that you're here today.
Thank you, Courtney.
You've been at the forefront of podcast research for a very long time. And something I run into all the time is that podcasters think they know their audience. They know who they want to reach. They know a general sense of who their show is for. But aside from looking at your analytics and being like, oh my gosh, my download numbers are not moving, from where you sit, what would you say are some of the specific signs that maybe a podcast host doesn't actually know their audience as well as they think they do?
One of the traps that podcasters run into is that kind of first-party data and hearing what you want to hear. Ultimately, when somebody's in your tent, you've already got them. It doesn't mean that it's not valuable to find out what they want. You should, right? Sometimes I'll joke about the fact that, the great news about having tools like SurveyMonkey is that you can do it yourself. The bad news is you can do it yourself. And so you end up getting into the trap of, a really good questionnaire, understanding what questions to ask is actually really difficult. And asking your audience what they think is great, but again, you're speaking to the people that already like you. And so the trick is, well, how do you get outside that? How do you understand what potential listeners want to get from your podcast? That's sometimes the missing link in this medium is how do we get to those target consumers that aren't already in your tent?
I agree. And it's a huge question mark in everyone's minds if they're thinking about it, right? A lot of them don't think about it. There's that category of podcast host who's like, I've got the message. I know generally who I want to speak to. I'm just going to launch the thing and I'm going to figure it out as I go. There's the other category who is more like me in the beginning of my show, where I'm like, okay, I kind of know who I want to speak to, but I want to do it right. I don't want to waste my time, creating something nobody listens to. So I did kind of default just to the, hey, friends, family, people on my email list. What do you think about this topic? Why don't you vote on this topic? And like you said, that has a place, but it also can be really valuable to get outside of that to really understand what the market is looking for. So Jay, over the years, I'm really curious, are there any kind of surprising patterns that you've seen in your research that might show us or indicate why some podcasts tend to stand out and why other podcasts that cover the same or similar topics just get overlooked?
Well, one of the big things is law of focus, for sure. There are a lot of podcasters that think that, and this isn't just germane to podcasting. You see this in other industries too, where it's like the thinking is that if we make it as broad as possible, well, then we're going to reach more people. Broad equals more, but that's not the way it works. The way it works is you find something that a group of people are really passionate about, and you're really good at delivering that. And that's how you're going to grow it. That, I think, is one of the biggest mistakes. We did a study, for example, of a branded podcast recently. And this particular one they were doing well in the kids and family category. And they knew what their audience wanted. But what about people that were interested in this type of content that they weren't reaching already? And they found some really fascinating things. They found, for example, that most people that were familiar didn't realize that this brand was sponsoring the podcast. They weren't getting any credit for it at all. And when it came to content, there was all kinds of things that they learned. One of them was that they were doing this kind of combination of situational things that would happen from a parenting perspective, rather than things that were more deeply about being a good human or being a good parent. And so we actually tested actual episode titles, and we could look at which ones tested better. And there was a real pattern that emerged. It wasn't just this tested better than this. It was, no. There's a pattern among the ones that test well and the ones that don't test as well. And from that, you can really learn strategically how to build a plan of content strategy and not just the themes of the episode, but how I title the episode. And then go a step deeper, like swim below the layer. And what you find is, okay, well, here's the difference of people that already know you and how they perceive it. And then here's the difference in people that don't. And looking at the differences, this is the key to any research project is, what we call cross-tabbing, right? And it's going in and finding, well, how did this do among this group? And how did this do among this group? And what are the differences? Because that's ultimately, going back to what we talked about originally, it's the big difference between talking to the people you know already and then looking at the differences and saying, well, how do I fill that gap? How do I appeal to the people that already know me? And then what can I do message-wise, content-wise, brand-wise to bring the new people in?
Yes. Okay. I love what you just said about the patterns that emerge. It's not so much just about A/B testing, which all of us are pretty familiar with, especially if you're listening, you've got a business background. We know, like, let's test a different email subject line and see which one gets more clicks. But taking that a level deeper and actually noticing the patterns. And Jay, this is where I feel like there's a big gap. People don't know how to do this. They don't understand the importance of doing this. And even for someone like myself, where it's like, this is my career. I love digging into data like that. But a lot of times the time that it takes to do that is a limitation in and of itself. So for someone who is curious, like, okay, I want to be able to understand these patterns. I'd love for that example you just shared where y'all were doing this testing for this podcast. How did that inform what they did next on their podcast in terms of future episode titles or future content?
Yeah, I mean, one of the patterns that emerged, well, they had, like, anytime you go into a research study, you have preconceived notions of what's going to come out of it. And sometimes people say, well, I already think I know what the answers are going to be, so I'm not going to do the research. Well, I'm here to tell you that even if you're right, even if every single notion you've got about what's going to come out of it ends up being correct, which, by the way, it won't, but even if it did, it's still valuable to do the research, Courtney. You know why? Because you're validating it. And validating your notions with data is still very valuable. But 99.9% of the time, there are going to be things that you learn in the research that you didn't expect. So in this particular example that you brought up, one of the things that came about, and we see this in brands that put on podcasts specifically quite a bit, is you have a marketing officer, a VP of marketing, a CMO that probably has created the podcasts, putting out the content. And then you might have somebody on a higher level that goes, why are we spending all this money on a podcast? What's the ROI of the podcast? I don't see specific money coming in, and we're not selling third-party ads, and what's going on here? And so the goal of this study was to answer a lot of those questions. And so, for example, one of the questions was about the talent. So how do people feel about the talent, both target consumers, if we play them some of the content, and current consumers? What do they think about the talent? They had questions about the treatment and the tone. And so one of the commonalities, one of the patterns that you asked about earlier, so this is a parenting advice podcast, right? And there was a line of thinking that this should be a very serious podcast about parenting advice. And what we found through the research was parenting is really hard. And parents don't want to hear something too serious when they're being given that advice. They want something a little more lighthearted. They're okay with some humor. And this was really important because there were varying degrees of opinions on what this should be. And again, some of that is going to come from your own preconceived notions of what it should be. But the audience and target audience was very clearly telling us this needs to be not too serious. Video was a big thing that came out of this. At the time, this was an audio-only podcast, and we asked specific questions about video, both platforms that they were using. Would you consume it more often if it was available in video? And this is a show that had zero YouTube presence that now gets over 100,000 views per episode. So they've done it very, very well, but it's just grown. It's grown everything kind of exponentially. Advertising was another thing we asked about. There are, I think, a lot of branded podcasts, for example, that are scared or hesitant to make it too salesy. I don't want to put my logo on there because people might, think it's too salesy and not ingest the content. Or we can't bring other advertisers in because that would spoil the soup. But the reality is we found that podcast consumers see it as, that's why it's free, right? Okay, fine. And it doesn't mean that you bring any advertiser in, it should be in sync with the brand, but it does mean that you've got some leeway to do that as an expectation. So those are some of the patterns that we learned. And so as they went into the next season, this was their roadmap. It was everything. It instructed how they built their YouTube channel, how they built thumbnails, which are very important in YouTube podcasting. It informed how they made their show notes. It informed their episode titles, artwork. I mean, all kinds of things came from that study, and their latest season has been fantastic.
Well, two important points that you bring up here in sharing this example is, number one, there are a lot of commonalities between branded podcasts and independent podcasts. And I think that independent podcasters listening to this right now, even though this is a branded podcast example, will also see themselves in that, because it's like, well, I also want to know exactly what my audience is looking for. And the other point, Jay, being this is why it's so important to get outside of the friends, family circle and the people who already know you and trust you circle, which leads me to the next question that I've been really itching to ask you about confirmation bias specifically. Because this is something in simple terms, really just, asking the people who already know, like, and trust you. Can you break down for us why this is so dangerous, and why in the context of podcasting, only focusing there ultimately will hurt you and or could cause you to go in a direction with your show that maybe you shouldn't go, and that maybe ultimately isn't going to help you grow?
So there's a philosophy that we talk about at Coleman called outside thinking. And outside thinking is obviously the opposite of inside thinking. And inside thinking is when you get too close to your product, to your brand. And you can't help but do this. Everybody does this, right? Like when I worked in radio and I worked at the radio station, I had the station on all day, every day. And then I put it on in the car, right? So on average, I was listening to the radio station how many hours a day? 10 hours a day. And that's ridiculous compared to the average listener who might be listening to the station, let's say, 15 minutes a day, right? 20 minutes a day. Okay. So what happens? We go out to a remote broadcast to meet listeners. Someone hosts us at a client, one of these, things that, invite listeners to come by and you give away prizes and stuff. And when you're out there, you think about different ways to give away prizes. And so maybe you ask trivia questions, and you ask questions about the talent, or you ask questions about the contests that you run. You ask questions about, all these different things about the radio station. And what do you find? You find that most listeners have no idea about all these little things that you're asking about, because they're not paying close attention. They're not listening to it like you listen to it. And that's the whole thing about outside thinking. Outside thinking takes you outside of your bubble to think about how the consumer views it. This is why it's so dangerous, because as a podcaster, you're viewing it from your lens. You're all up in it. You know your business, if it's a business or whatever you're promoting, you know it better than anybody else. But the person on the other side more than likely doesn't. They're not paying very careful attention to it. They're not doing the research. And so you have to step back and say, how do I structure this to reach people that don't necessarily understand it the way that I do?
Yeah. Oh, and it's so important too. And we see this play out, when we're working with our podcasters, where the tendency is to want to just ask people who already know you and to say, well, I posted about it on my Instagram and all of them voted yes for this title over that one, or this cover art over that one. And I'm like, yeah, but we also got to go outside of that, right? And you just explained so beautifully and so correctly and succinctly why that is so important. Something else, Jay, that I see all the time though in the podcasting space is survivorship bias too, where a lot of times people, without even realizing it, are catering to a shrinking audience and a smaller and smaller audience. And they're creating what they think is for that audience without realizing that because the audience is now getting smaller and smaller and smaller, we're actually excluding a lot of people. Can you elaborate on that and how this shows up in podcasting and why this is a trap?
Yeah, I mean, and ultimately it's evolving. That's one of the reasons that it's important to kind of do research on a fairly regular basis, because audience behavior is evolving massively. I mean, look at what we're seeing even just in video in the last year and a half since we did our first video study. And when we asked people, for example, a year and a half ago, how they would define a podcast, and 75% of them said audio or video. And then we ask the same question just 18 months later, and it's 85%. That is just a staggering increase. 10 points in a year and a half. It's wild. And so we're seeing audience shifting taking place all over the place. One of the things that we saw, for example, Courtney, the question that's been asked about discovery, that's been asked in every research study ever, how do people discover podcasts? And the number one answer is always what? Friends and family, right? Always friends and family. Until in our latest study, we see social media for the first time come to number one. And when you dig into it and look at Gen Z, the gap between social media and friends and family is much wider. And that's just going to continue to be the fact. Influencer and celebrity is really impactful among Gen Z. So these are the things that you can't really specifically look at that audience and where it was and how it might be dwindling, because the shifts are just constantly taking place. There's always an evolution, particularly in this medium, more than almost any I've ever seen.
Yes. And I think that's one of the frustrating points about podcasting is the industry evolves so quickly. And so it's a lot to keep up with. And it's like just when you find your groove and you kind of get things going with your podcast and then something changes and you see a study come out that says, oh, you need to be on video. And you're like, wait, I don't want to be on video. Do I need to be on video? Right? It just creates all this confusion. And I think this is also why it's really important to understand your audience, because if you are speaking to, let's say, Gen Xers or boomers, that's going to be different than a Gen Z audience. I can see why social media would emerge in the data if Gen Z is who's really listening to podcasts right now. And, because they were raised on cell phones and social media. And so that is their natural way of connecting. So of course, that's also going to be naturally how they're finding out about new things and communicating and new information. Whereas for a different generation, that's going to look totally different. And so all this just further underscores your point, Jay, about understanding who you are speaking to and actually having the data to back that up. So for someone listening right now who's kind of getting tired of like, okay, I'm asking my audience, what do you want to hear? And they're not really getting clear answers. And now they're listening to our conversation and going, okay, well, what do I do differently? If downloads is not really telling me anything and feedback from my friends and my super fans is not really the way to go either. What's the next step for someone who really wants to know if their show is resonating with new listeners? Walking away from this episode, what's one thing they can focus on?
I would say the ideal scenario is, look at potential research where you can get to target audiences that you couldn't otherwise reach. It is great to run, promos and announcements on your own podcast and ask people to go and fill out surveys or invite them on social media to fill out surveys. And you should use that first party data because it can be very valuable. I would encourage you outside of that when you can. It's great to look at, companies like ours that are able to get third-party data, unbiased, develop a strategy to say, okay, here's who my target consumer is, here's what they're interested in, kind of age level, and get as much intel as you can on how you can optimize your podcast for them otherwise. In the absence of that, in the absence of budget, I think it's going out and looking at existing research studies. It could be from our company and it could be from other companies as well that put out studies that might be relevant to your category and definitely relevant to the changes taking place in podcasting to try and understand your audience at least that level so that you can make some strategic decisions based on it.
Super great advice. And Jay, thank you for being here and for the work that you guys are doing in the podcasting space, because it is very needed. I think a lot of people don't realize how needed it is, but it truly is. And for those listening today, take this advice to heart. Actually take something away from this episode and just go seek to learn one new thing about your audience. Not the people who already listen, but those who you want to potentially reach, because ultimately that is how you're going to be able to grow, is by reaching those cold audiences. So Jay, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Courtney.
And if this has you wondering how to test your podcast ideas with the right listeners, with new listeners out there who need to know about you, but who don't know about you yet, not just your friends or your family or your super fans, then you are especially going to love the next episode, because Jay is joining us back to share how testing with people who don't know you can reveal blind spots that you would never catch on your show otherwise. And he's going to walk you through how to tell if your podcast idea, your branding, your packaging, even your episode content will resonate with new listeners, whether you are launching, whether you are rebranding, or whether you are trying to break past a growth plateau with your show. All of that is coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.